Tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion are the second two processes that compose what we know as urine formation. These processes specifically involve the peritubular capillaries as well as the renal tubule of the nephron. As discussed in the last video, through glomerular filtration, most of the substances that are in the blood are actually filtered into the Bowman's capsule. In fact, in just half an hour, the amount of fluid that enters the proximal convoluted tubules is greater than the entire total blood plasma volume of the entire body. So clearly, our bodies can't afford to lose that much fluid that quickly. There definitely needs to be some reabsorption and correction, as glomerular filtration is forcing many of the good substances out of the blood as well as the bad substances. So what we're going to see is that water, glucose, amino acids, and ions are all going to be reabsorbed throughout the different components of the renal tubule. Normally, just about 99% of all of the water that is filtered out into the Bowman's capsule will be reabsorbed. This explains how we can filter out these massive amounts of fluid, but not actually lose that much fluid. But of course, glucose, amino acids, and ions are all other small things that will need to be reabsorbed as well. We can't go and get rid of all of the glucose that's found in the blood. That would not be a very good use of our body's glucose. So in fact, eventually, 100% of all of our glucose should be reabsorbed. There should not be any glucose that can be found in the urine. So that's actually going to give us some insight on a condition known as glucosuria. Glucosuria means that there's glucose in the urine, and this is often shown in patients that have diabetes mellitus. Remember, diabetes mellitus is when the beta pancreatic cells are in some way defective, and we're not producing as much insulin as our body needs. Insulin is going to be used to uptake glucose into our body cells. And if we don't have the insulin to uptake glucose, the increased levels of blood glucose will eventually lead to excess glucose lost in the urine. Now, in terms of reabsorption, you can see in this picture at the left the lumen of the renal tubule, and you can see the peritubular capillaries shown here. We'll have these cells with their microvilli, and there's going to be two different types of transport mechanisms of substances to be reabsorbed back into the peritubular capillaries. These two mechanisms are referred to as paracellular reabsorption and transcellular reabsorption. Paracellular reabsorption is when substances are taken between cells into the interstitial fluid and then allowed to flow into the peritubular capillaries. We call this paracellular reabsorption because reabsorption is facilitated next to our cells. Transcellular reabsorption, on the other hand, is when substances are taken into the cells and eventually transported out across the cell membrane. We're going to find lots and lots of transporters embedded in the apical membrane on this side, contacting the fluid in the lumen of the nephron, and also certain transporters embedded in the basolateral membrane, which can be seen here, contacting the interstitial fluid. Transporters in the membrane will generally only move substances in one direction. There are different types of transporters that will transport different substances, and also different types of transporters can be found in different parts of the nephron. Now, reabsorption is going to be used to make sure that substances that are good and useful to the body are not excreted in the urine excessively. But in the event that too much of a substance is reabsorbed, we're going to go into tubular secretion. And those substances are going to be moved from the peritubular capillaries into the lumen of the nephron. Generally, tubular secretion has two roles for the body. First, we're going to be secreting hydrogen ions into the lumen of the nephron to help regulate our body's pH. And in the event that there are toxic substances or an excess of ions that have been reabsorbed, secretion is going to kick in and get rid of the excess. Just as with reabsorption, certain substances are going to be secreted more readily in different parts of the nephron. But one player that we're specifically going to describe the reabsorption and secretion of is water. The two types of water reabsorption that we're going to discuss are obligatory water reabsorption and facultative water reabsorption. As this slide indicates, obligatory water reabsorption accounts for 90% of all of the water reabsorption that our kidneys are going to facilitate. And the other 10% is going to be facultative water reabsorption, and this is going to happen primarily in the collecting ducts. Obligatory water reabsorption is named because in this type of reabsorption, water is going to follow the solutes that are already being reabsorbed. We must think back to the concept of osmosis, how the solvent is going to follow the solutes. And so if solutes are moved from one side of a membrane to another, water is going to follow by osmosis. We call this obligatory water reabsorption because water is obliged to follow because of the osmotic pressure gradients that are changing when solutes move compartments. Now the remaining 10% of water is facultative water reabsorption. And this type of reabsorption is capable of adapting to whatever needs the body has. This type of water reabsorption is going to be regulated by antidiuretic hormone. We remember that antidiuretic hormone was the hormone that was released from the posterior pituitary gland, and it was also called vasopressin. Antidiuretic hormone prevents the process of diuresis, which is urine formation. So therefore, when antidiuretic hormone is present, that's going to retain water and not allow that water to be further secreted. So what we can gather from this slide is that most of the water that is filtered through glomerular filtration will be reabsorbed through obligatory water reabsorption by controlling the solute concentrations throughout the nephron. There will not specifically be any water transporters, it's simply going to move all on its own because of osmosis. But once we get to the collecting duct, facultative water reabsorption is going to be controlled by antidiuretic hormone, as our fluid intake is generally highly variable. We're going to break down both of these types of water reabsorption in much more detail throughout the remainder of this presentation, but I first want to go into the tubular reabsorption that takes place in the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, as well as the distal convoluted tubule. Now the proximal convoluted tubule specifically is the most active reabsorber of all of the parts of the nephron. Since it is right after the Bowman's capsule, it's the first place that the filtrate is going to go, and therefore it's going to facilitate most of the reabsorption out of any parts in the nephron. Many different substances are reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule, and just to be more specific, the proximal convoluted tubule will reabsorb about 65% of all of the water that is filtered out, as well as about 65% of all the sodium and 65% of all the potassium. Generally, all of the glucose and all of the amino acids are also going to be pulled back from the proximal convoluted tubule as well. Significant amounts of many other ions and solutes will also be reabsorbed by the proximal convoluted tubule. And you'll find additional information about tubular reabsorption on page 1012 in your textbook. Now with the loop of Henle specifically, we want to remember that there's a descending limb and an ascending limb. The descending limb is often called the thin descending limb and will have the thick ascending limb as well as the thin ascending limb as well. But we're just going to consider that thick ascending limb as the descending limb and the ascending limb are going to be reabsorbing different things. For our purposes, the descending limb of the loop of Henle is only going to be permeable to water. Water is going to have a lot of reabsorption taking place in that descending limb. And as the filtrate continues on over to the ascending limb, water reabsorption is going to stop, and then electrolytes and other solute particles will then have their reabsorption taking place in that part. We will talk a little bit more about this in just a few slides. The distal convoluted tubule is going to contribute to water and sodium reabsorption. The cells of the distal convoluted tubule will have receptors for antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone, and those two chemicals are going to help regulate tubular reabsorption in the distal convoluted tubule. Let's take a look at these hormones and see what their role is. So similarly to the hormonal control of glomerular filtration, angiotensin II is going to be released due to exactly the same stimuli. If there's low blood volume or low blood pressure, that's going to lead to the juxtaglomerular cells releasing more renin, eventually producing more angiotensin II. Angiotensin II is then going to go and stimulate sodium-hydrogen transporters in the proximal tubule. And by activating sodium reabsorption, that's going to increase the reabsorption of sodium itself, and also that's going to pull more water into the bloodstream by reabsorption as well. This is obligatory water reabsorption, as water is only following the sodium that was reabsorbed thanks to angiotensin II. By reabsorbing more sodium, we're increasing osmotic pressure in the peritubular capillaries. That's going to pull more water in, and that's going to increase blood volume and in turn increase blood pressure. We also have aldosterone that's playing similar roles that are also going to help the regulation of tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion. We'll hopefully remember that aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid, and it comes from the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex. What stimulated its release was angiotensin II. So when angiotensin II is present, more aldosterone is going to be released by the adrenal cortex. Another stimulus for this that we haven't quite discussed thus far is increased levels of potassium. Once aldosterone is released, that's going to amp up the sodium-potassium pump and also activate sodium channels that can be found in the collecting duct. By stimulating that sodium-potassium pump, more potassium is going to be released and more sodium is going to be reabsorbed. Because we're reabsorbing sodium, water is also going to follow, just like it did up here thanks to angiotensin II, and that's going to increase blood volume and increase blood pressure. This too will fit into the category of obligatory water reabsorption. Here we can see that antidiuretic hormone is also going to play a very important role in water reabsorption. In the event that blood volume has gone down, or perhaps our body's extracellular fluid has increased its osmolarity, that will stimulate more release of antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary gland. Just so that we're aware, osmolarity for our purposes is a measure of concentration. So when the extracellular fluid is more concentrated, more antidiuretic hormone is going to be released so that we can retain more water and therefore dilute that extracellular fluid. When antidiuretic hormone is released, this is specifically going to work in the distal convoluted tubule and in the collecting ducts. Antidiuretic hormone is going to bind to receptors and lead to the insertion of water channels into the membrane of the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. As antidiuretic hormone is present, that's going to prevent diuresis and lead to water retention. So we're going to get more water reabsorption, and that's going to decrease this increased concentration that was taking place. This is going to fall under the category of facultative water reabsorption. The remaining 10% of all water reabsorption is carried out by antidiuretic hormone specifically. And then another familiar player here, atrial natriuretic peptide. We know what stimulates the release of this hormone, and that's going to be the stretching of the atria. Just as it did with glomerular filtration, atrial natriuretic peptide is going to work against antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone, and angiotensin II. In the event that there's greater stretching of the heart, more atrial natriuretic peptide will be released. Oftentimes we get more atrial stretching when blood volume is high. So atrial natriuretic peptide is actually going to prevent the reabsorption of sodium, and therefore that's going to leave more water in the renal tubule. This is working against antidiuretic hormone, angiotensin II, and aldosterone, and you can see that it actually inhibits their release as well. By suppressing sodium reabsorption, more sodium is going to be excreted in the urine, and therefore more water is going to be leaving in the urine as well. So that's going to increase the entire urine output as well. By releasing more urine, we're going to be left with a lower blood volume and a lower blood pressure. So once again, atrial natriuretic peptide is the outlier here, as this works against the other hormonal regulators. Now, one last hormonal regulator of tubular reabsorption that we're going to see is parathyroid hormone. This is a little unrelated to water, however this is going to increase reabsorption of another mineral, calcium. This would have been discussed in Chapter 18 when we were going over the endocrine system, but in the event that our blood calcium levels are low, that's going to stimulate more release of parathyroid hormone, and parathyroid hormone, on top of activating osteoclasts, are also going to open up calcium channels in the distal convoluted tubule, increasing calcium reabsorption. So as I mentioned earlier, generally our body's fluid intake is highly variable. This means that we go through periods where we take in lots of fluids, and there are other periods where we might not take in nearly as much. Just as all other homeostatic conditions, fluid volumes need to remain between very, very narrow parameters. And so in the event that we're taking in lots of fluids, we're going to excrete more fluids. In the event that we're not taking in as many fluids, we're going to retain fluids. And it's primarily going to be our body's facultative water reabsorption that's going to control how much water is excreted in the urine. In the presence of antidiuretic hormone, fluids are going to be retained, and therefore a much more concentrated urine is going to be released. But also, in the event that our intake of fluids is very high, we're going to end up releasing more of those fluids in the urine, leading to a very dilute urine of higher volume than our low volume concentrated urine. Let's take a look at how antidiuretic hormone is going to control the osmolarity of the urine. So one thing that we need to remember is that when we get here to the descending limb of the loop of Henle, only water reabsorption is going to take place. So what that means is that as the filtrate moves down the descending limb of the loop of Henle, water is being reabsorbed, and therefore the fluid on the inside of this tubule is getting more concentrated as it makes its way to the hairpin turn of the loop of Henle. This is why we state that osmolarity in the tubule is actually going to increase in the descending limb. Basically, we're saying that concentration is increasing as we go down this descending limb of the loop of Henle. But as we move up the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, the osmolarity is going to decrease. In the ascending limb, we're going to have a decrease in concentration. And this is because only solutes and electrolytes are able to be reabsorbed in the thick ascending limb. And as we continue through the distal convoluted tubule, more solutes will get pumped out, and that's eventually going to lead to a more dilute urine as we make our way to the collecting duct. You can see that this picture is showing you osmolarity as we go through the nephron. I don't need you guys to be experts on the numbers here, but I just want you to see that as we go higher in number, we're going to be more concentrated, and we can say that this fluid's going to have a higher osmolarity, and as we go lower in number, we'll say that concentration's going to go down, and the fluid has a lower osmolarity. So we know that in the descending limb of the loop of Henle, water reabsorption is going to take place. That is why the osmolarity is going up as we make our way down to this hairpin turn. Water is getting pulled out, and therefore leaving more of the solutes in this portion of the tubule. But as we go up, water reabsorption is going to stop, and then solute reabsorption is going to kick in this thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Eventually, the solute concentration is going to go down so much that the fluid is actually more dilute when we get to the distal convoluted tubule. You can see that these parameters are shown right here. There's a transporter known as the sodium-potassium 2-chloride transporter that's going to pump all of these in that ratio at the exact same time. And there's not going to be a lot of water permeability in the thick ascending limb either. So only solutes are able to leave and water is not. That's why we get a more dilute fluid in this distal convoluted tubule as we go from the thick ascending limb onward. So if we're forming a dilute urine, that's going to mean that we've had a lot of water intake. We're going to need to excrete that excess water, and by the time substances make their way up to the collecting duct, we don't need to retain any more fluids. So there won't be any stimuli to release antidiuretic hormone, and in the absence of antidiuretic hormone, we are not going to prevent diuresis. We're going to let diuresis take hold, and therefore we're going to get more urine production, which is going to produce a more dilute urine. Now on the other side of this, in the presence of antidiuretic hormone, the collecting ducts are going to become very, very permeable to facilitate the reabsorption of water. Think about when we would release antidiuretic hormone when there's a low blood volume, or perhaps we're dehydrated. In those instances, we want to retain more water, so therefore the collecting ducts will become more permeable to water. So in the absence of antidiuretic hormone, we form a dilute urine. In the presence of antidiuretic hormone, we're going to form a concentrated urine. To further hit home this point, we're going to very, very briefly cover the countercurrent exchange and the countercurrent multiplier. What we first must understand is that salt is always being filtered out of the blood and into the renal tubule. So therefore, more salt is always being added to the proximal convoluted tubule. Now naturally, the more salty the extracellular fluid outside of the renal tubule, the more water is going to be reabsorbed in this descending limb. Remember, only water can leave the descending limb of the loop of Henle. But we must also consider that the more water that leaks out of the descending limb of the loop of Henle, the more concentrated the fluids on the inside of the renal tubule will be. We're eventually going to produce a very, very concentrated fluid as we make our way down here to this hairpin turn. And as we move up the thick ascending limb, these solutes are going to start getting transported out and reabsorbed back into the peritubular capillaries. The saltier this fluid is, the more those substances are going to be pumped out into the extracellular fluid. And that's going to make the extracellular fluid much, much more salty. You can see that we have this cycle, that the more salty the extracellular fluid, the more water will be pulled out. The more water that's pulled out, the saltier the filtrate becomes. The saltier the filtrate is, the more solutes are pumped out. And then we go ahead and repeat this entire process once again. I will just mention very, very briefly that there is in fact a third capillary bed known as the vasa recta that is wrapping around the nephron. It specifically runs in the opposite direction as the nephron will. If the nephron is running from left to right, the vasa recta is actually going to flow from right to left. And that's why we call it the countercurrent exchange and the countercurrent multiplier system. The vasa recta will provide oxygen and nutrients to the renal medulla, as the cells in the loop of Henle will need these for energy. The vasa recta is a critical player in the countercurrent exchange system, as it will help maintain the osmotic gradient in the renal medulla.